So now that I've taught you how to make kicks and snares, and also in an older video I also explained how to make percussion out of anything, let's go ahead and figure out how to turn this sound, or any sound really, into a bass. And now what categorizes a bass obviously is low frequencies, and sometimes no matter how much you process a sound, it's very difficult for you to get a clean sine. So let's go ahead and try some contemporary means first, and then we'll see if we can't get around that and resort to other more quote-unquote drastic measures if we must. So for now, I'm just going to pick a sound out of here. This is just a loop as I always use, and we'll find something that works. So that's already kind of bassy. So this seems like a fun challenge. Let's go ahead and grab this one, and you can grab anything, but let's just see what we can kind of work with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just lower the volume, or lower the pitch of this, and see what that turns into. Now, one thing that I want to pay attention to is what kind of frequencies this possesses. So it's already got some low end, so that means that we can actually boost some of this before we get into doing anything else. And you can actually kind of cheat this by imposing a fundamental. So if I were to maybe just say, all right, we were going to work on this in G, then I can actually force G as long as there's a harmonic here, and maybe reduce everything else below this in order to create something. Now obviously there's not really a whole lot to work with on this, but that's okay because we can actually try some other methods too. So for one, we could actually set this to repitch mode and see what happens if we were to stretch this out. And what I can do now is maybe just leave this on here. Now, as you can see, we're kind of boosting this up a little bit, but it's not really a whole lot. It's giving us a little bit of this, but what I want to do is maybe add in some saturation, maybe something with Saturn 2, or you can use kilohertz. You can actually, let's do something more basic like the distortion on here. So I'm just going to use this, and I'm going to focus on these lows right here and see if I can get this to boost up just a little bit more. So with this, we're not even driving this yet, and we're already starting to get some low end frequencies. So that's at 24. Maybe it would be a little bit wiser to try to boost something that's more within the register. For some reason, C1 is actually C0, so everything is an octave higher than what it's supposed to be. But let's grab that G over at 48 kilohertz, and let's see if we can kind of boost this up instead. So we're going to come on over here. This is at 37. We're going to try somewhere around here. It doesn't need to be precise, but we're just going to start to boost this and see what we can get. Oh, and there we go. We made a bass. It was super easy, right? So before we get into anything else, we need to make sure that we're going to clip this. And I'm just going to set this to here, because now that we have this, we can actually start to shape this in different ways. Now you can apply more and more distortion over time. You can force this fundamental to happen, but sometimes by playing with small amounts of distortion and then doing creative effects in between, you can actually end up turning this into a neurobass or something. Not always, but it does work sometimes. So but now that we have that, we're pretty much distorting the entire signal, so we want to try to start thinking about removing some of that mud that might be present. So also, I think that if we actually low pass this, we're going to get some interesting stuff too. So now from this, we can actually turn this up quite a bit, or we can even try something like an OTT. I'm not going to do that. If we wanted to bring back some of the original texture, then we could actually go into this, and we could grab some dynamics here and start to turn this up just a bit. Now this might not sound all that interesting, but if you were to take this and then toss it into, say, a sampler or so, then you can say, okay, well, this is supposed to be at G0, right? So theoretically, if we pitch this correctly, now we take this off and we play this. Then what we can also do with this is we can start to set this here and start to set these different loop points and maybe give it some crossover. So that way so now you can start to see that we're actually getting something that's more reminiscent of a bass. Yeah, so there's some other things that you can do with this. I'm not going to go super deep into this just because this is really just a concept, but from here we can kind of hear that it's got some texture on here, and you can reach for an OTT. I'm actually just going to reach for a band split on here, and this is actually just going to turn this up and we're going to add saturation to it. But let's see what this sounds like. Sounds pretty cool. We can also clip this again and make it a little bit fatter if we wanted to. So by turning this on, you don't have to go into a hard clipper, but just clipping in general while trying to push the volume pretty high can be super useful. Because now we're getting some really cool movement patterns with this. So let me go ahead and back up real quick, because at this point in time, you're pretty much going to be doing the same thing that we're talking about here, which is shaping and manipulating harmonics. The thing with this, though, is that there's other ways in which to introduce sub outside of just doing what I did here. So we can try a couple of other different approaches. For example, if I wanted to focus just on this, let me turn this off. Yeah, not all that interesting. But what we can also do is, I'm going to go to maybe an A here, is actually, let me just go into a new one I think would be the best way to go. So let's go Pro Q3. I'm going to reduce this one just to kind of even that out, and then I'm going to just boost this ever so slightly. So with this, we're already getting some like rumble on the low end and stuff, but it's not really a whole lot to work with, if you will. So a couple of things that we can do are, well, I'll show you three different options. So here's the first one. You got to be careful with this one, because what's going to happen is we're going to end up basically imposing a frequency. So let's say we wanted to go back to that G. We're going to find somewhere around 48 hertz. It doesn't need to be exact, but that's okay. So now that we have something kind of like this, we can start to introduce feedback, which is going to be on the low end. So take a look. So with this, in theory, this should be introducing quite a bit more of that low end of that feedback. So now if we were to pull this up and maybe find that G1 again, what we could also do is pull off of this. And you can hear that this isn't perfect, right? Especially because it's feedback. So that's one thing that you kind of have to be mindful of, but you definitely can actually use something like a delay or whatever to introduce some kind of insane feedback on this. So if we were to actually boost this, then you can see that we're actually starting to get pretty close. And so one thing that you might want to do is pull off of this, but really try to focus on removing the surrounding frequency ranges. So and now that we have that, we can actually kind of start to pull this back up again if we wanted to. And the other thing that I want to do on this is be careful, but we can try to pull this up. Now, this is better served for like low end rumble or something of the sort, but I mean, if we were to kind of overkill this, let's see what we can get into. I'm going to try the heavy saturation and see what this does. Maybe gentle. Nice. So that's one way to do it. It's not the cleanest way, but you're going to have to do a few more steps in order to make it work. But we can kind of hear that the fundamental is kind of popping up. So that's always an option too. So the last thing that I would recommend giving a shot for, just to have fun and mess around, is actually using a resonator. So not this one, but if you use just a regular resonator and perhaps you were to, let's do this to where we're going to create a chain here. And on this one, I'm going to create a low pass filter because we only have the choice between saw waves and square waves. And so because of that, we might want to back off of this and try this just at, let's go to that G0 here, which would be around here. Now we can just listen to this at 100% mix. Right, which is starting to sound very similar to what we were just doing with the feedback, right? Because we've got that resonator. But if we use that filter on here, kind of like what we talked about before, then we might be able to kind of find a nice tone through this. And you can kind of hear it a little bit, yeah? So again, by kind of pushing that low end up and seeing if we can make that work. But no matter how you do this, you're still most likely going to have to add some kind of saturation to it just to be able to tame what the actual frequency is. So it might be worth even just pulling back on this to say the fundamental and then adding some resonance. And now that we have something like that, it might be worth maybe even mixing in. So we could clip this on this one per se. Right. But what we can do is now we can slowly start to introduce this to the original signal, and on this one with this filter we can actually, I was wondering where that went, we can actually take out the low end of this. So we can do something kind of like this. And because of that, it's really cool. Now we've got something that's kind of on the low end and then something that's kind of in texture mode. And whenever you're ready to actually use this, I think that it would be really wise to bounce this into audio so that way you can control the tails. But what if we were to do something kind of like a ring mod and create a flutter with this? Say like the mix is here and we pull back off of this. So and then what we can do is we can kind of just clip that again and maybe hard clip it, and now we've got some really cool harmonics and stuff that we can mess with as a whole. Now the other thing is that I guess that OTT is still on here, so we can try to pull that back if we want. So actually let's see what this is without it. Yeah, so you can use that as an OTT. We can also make the mids wide. There's so much that we can do with this. Give me 1 second. I'm going to turn this down because my partner is asleep in the back. But so we can try to crank this up and see what that will turn into. Or, you know, if you want to distort this again, we can maybe add some saturation to this. And then because we have these higher harmonics, we can actually get into what's going on here. I don't want that. We can actually toss in a multipass and experiment with different, multi-filter things to see if we can actually create some kind of neurobase out of this. So if I were to go into even chameleon filter or whatever, which I think has a predefined movement pattern, I want to say, yeah. So even if we were to turn this off and maybe set this to random over this way, we might be able to get some interesting movement on this. Set the jitter up, turn the mix on. Or try a bunch of different ones of these that might be interesting. There we go. So we pretty much made a neurobase out of just some random percussive sound, and then we can go through the same process of OTT and all that other good stuff in order to make this work. So in general, I think that, it's really just a matter of understanding how to shape harmonics and frequencies as a whole, because once you have even just a basic sine wave, then, really the world is yours. It doesn't take a whole lot in order to do something like that. The only thing that you might want to be concerned about is sometimes through this, there's not really a lot to work with. There's no predefined fundamental. And obviously, as you take a look at this, it's like almost nothing, right? So there's a little bit here, but you kind of have to pick something and be like, all right, well, the fundamental is going to be this. And then I'm going to stick that through into a sampler so that way we can control the pitch of it and manipulate it as a whole. So hopefully that was helpful to you. The next video we'll be taking a look at doing like pads and stuff, I believe, and that should be a lot of fun because you'll see that really the versatility behind all this stuff it doesn't really matter. So anyways, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll be back with those pads here in a sec.